Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and you've found your way to Kinda Murdery, a place that means more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories, the unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. Hello everybody, welcome to Kinda Murdery. I'm your host, Zevin Odelberg, and I am so happy to have you here with me today. We are launching a new themed series here on Kinda Murdery entitled American Grifter. And, in general, these days, I don't know if it's because people have no attention span or what, but you'll see a top 10 list, right? And it'll start at number 1 and then go to number 10. And I actually hate that because I like the suspense of working my way from 10 or 100 or whatever it is up to 1. But nevertheless, I'm going to commit that same sin today because we are starting not with some little known confidence man, not with some anonymous grifter, but with arguably the most famous grifter in the history of grifting, and everybody knows that that is a profession that goes back almost as far as the oldest one. That's right. The subject of today's story is none other than Charles Ponzi himself. But I'm not here to tell you the story of how he invented the pyramid scheme exactly. So I'm not here to tell you the central Ponzi story. No, this is a tale of Charles Ponzi on the lam. Charles Ponzi running from the law years after he was initially busted for defrauding so many investors. That's right. I bring you the first in the American Grifter series, Episode 1, Run, Chucky, Run. It is time to rock and... Just kidding. It's not time to rock and roll. You know what time it is. It is time to make like beloved Eddie Munson and heavy metal because Kinda Murdery starts now. Charles Ponzi had escaped. Over land and sea, wireless messages were dispatched by frantic officials at police headquarters and from the Attorney General's office in Boston, Massachusetts. Ponzi, the dapper Italian, quote, financial wizard of School Street, was wanted by the police. Back in 1919, everybody knew Charles Ponzi. His name was on the tongue of almost every man and woman in the United States. He had come to this country to make money. He had peddled fruit, waited on tables, worked as a clerk, and, incidentally, which was not so widely known, had served time at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary for smuggling Chinese nationals. Now he declared he'd gotten hold of the big idea, and this big idea was so vast, so audacious in conception, that the financial world stood aghast. It seemed impossible, a mad figment of the imagination. Ponzi, it was rumored, had started his career on a 5-cent postage stamp, but whether that was true or not, he now rolled up a business based upon the profits said to have accrued from the difference in value between foreign and domestic exchange notes in international reply coupons, which called for payments aggregating the stupendous amount of $14 million. Charles Ponzi promised a profit of 50% in 45 days. Money poured in so fast that it had to be stored in wastebaskets. Vehicular traffic on School Street was stopped for 2 days while investors, with fists full of money, fought to get into Ponzi's office. Police were called to keep the crowds in line. Charles Ponzi was riding on top of the world. He bought a magnificent house in Lexington, Massachusetts. He drove about in an expensive limousine. He installed a staff of servants at his home and bought his wife magnificent jewels. Somebody named a 5-cent cigar after him. It was even intimated that he might run for the office of governor of Massachusetts. Then, the governor, always inconsiderate in cases of this kind, grew suspicious. Investigations were started. Investors who had mortgaged homes and automobiles to get in on this get-rich-quick scheme grew alarmed. A run started, but the first notes presented for payment were promptly paid. More money poured into Ponzi's coffers. Policemen who were called to quell a near riot stayed and invested. Officials became frankly puzzled. Ponzi claimed he had secret agents stationed in all countries, buying international reply coupons in ways in which it would be impossible to trace. Foreign countries became worried. It looked as though existing financial standards of interest might be turned topsy-turvy. Investigators hesitated about calling Ponzi's scheme fraudulent. They honestly didn't know, but he might have discovered some secret way of manipulating the foreign exchange. However, patient investigation proved his operations to be fraudulent, and the crash came. Ponzi was convicted of using the mails to defraud and received a sentence of 5 years. The Hanover Trust Company and several other Boston banks closed as a result of these wild speculations. Investors who'd made enormous profits were forced to make restitution. Ponzi himself went to jail. When released, he was rearrested and faced state indictment. There were more trials and more delays. Ponzi went to Florida and announced to the world that he would sell house lots at $10 a lot to pay back his investors. Money flowed in, and more trouble followed. He was ordered back to Massachusetts to stand trial, and, mysteriously, disappeared. The manhunt was on. Charles Ponzi had become a fugitive from justice. Once again, the wizard occupied front-page space in all the newspapers. There were plenty of rumors concerning his whereabouts. Most of these rumors were carefully investigated. It was said he had entertained at a roadhouse in New Hampshire. Later, he had vanished in the direction of the Canadian border, driving an expensive, speedy roadster. Others said he was in Florida. There were reports he'd been seen in Paris, and one correspondent even insisted that he was in Rome. It began to look as though Charles Ponzi had well and truly escaped. In Boston, disgruntled and disillusioned, investors demanded action. Police Inspector John F. Mitchell was assigned to the case. Meanwhile, down on the Gulf of Mexico, the sick boss non vobis, a foreign ship flying the Italian flag, was leisurely making her way towards Galveston, the last port of call before returning to Italy. By the way, sic vos non vobis is Latin for you work, but not for yourselves. On board the sic vos, disguised as a waiter, was Charles Ponzi himself, international man of mystery. He had Austin Powers beat by about 75 some odd years. Ponzi had escaped the manhunt by a very clever scheme. Those were, after all, clever schemes, his true core competence. So here was the scheme. When news came that Ponzi was wanted back in Massachusetts, he was in Tampa, Florida. By luck, he happened to meet an old friend of his from Boston, one Italian Joe, to whom he explained his plight. "I'll do my best," Joe promised him, "but I don't know what that'll be. Lie low for a time and I'll see what I can do." A little later, Joe sought Ponzi again. This time, his face was wreathed in smiles. "I think it can be arranged," he said. "There's an Italian ship in port, the Sic Vos von Vobis. She's returning to Italy within several weeks. I think I can get you a job on her on board as a waiter. Shall I try?" Yes, said Ponzi. "Only hurry." Wires were pulled, and Charles Ponzi found himself on board the Italian ship, headed eventually for his native land and freedom. Charles Ponzi, the foppish, smooth-faced American, had disappeared. In his place was Andrea Luciana, dressed in the rough clothing of an ordinary seaman. It was a good disguise. Head and eyebrows were shaved. He wore long side whiskers and a mustache. Luciana was apparently what he represented himself to be, an ignorant foreigner who understood no English and was not particularly bright. The ship sailed from Tampa. Ponzi breathed a sigh of relief as he saw the shore recede in the distance. That night, he became acquainted with the young wireless operator on board the ship. Day by day, he cultivated a friendship with his native-born Italian until they were upon intimate terms. Night after night, he listened in on the wireless and heard the police searching for one Charles Ponzi. The Italian wireless operator said that the country seemed quite disturbed about this man Ponzi, and Luciana smiled. He was safe. His scheme had worked. His exultation grew as he learned he had been located first in one place and then another. The stupid American police had been completely fooled, and he, Charles Ponzi, had done it. He was safe. Safe! But Ponzi, who had so successfully shut tight all avenues of information for the time being, had overlooked the most important factor of all, which would make his escape a success or a failure. He had neglected to take his own egotism and conceit into consideration, and this egotism came to the forefront as he saw safety within his grasp and realized that once more he had outwitted the Massachusetts authorities. This feeling grew more intense as the police messages became more urgent, and Ponzi appreciated the situation. Finally, he grew so pleased with himself that he was unable to keep his identity a secret for a moment longer. He was up in the wireless room. He had just listened to a long message reporting his whereabouts in some Midwestern city and heard with gusto the steps being taken to bring about his arrest. "That chap Ponzi is giving the police a good chase," said the operator as he removed the earphones from his head for a few moments. "He's a bright chap." "You think so?" Ponzi glowed as he heard praise of himself. "You think so?" Something in Ponzi's tone made the operator turn. "Well, of course I think so," he replied emphatically. "He's a one clever guy." "Listen," Ponzi said softly, looking around to make sure they were not overheard. "If I tell you something very secret, will you promise to keep your mouth shut?" The operator nodded. Ponzi bent still closer. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. The operator smiled. "Andrea Luciana, the waiter," he said. "Not at all. I am Charles Ponzi, the financial wizard." The operator started. A gleam of admiration came into his eyes. "Not the Charles Ponzi the police are looking for." By the way, everybody, forgive my terrible cartoon Italian accent. If it helps at all, I am Italian myself. My mother's maiden name was Brocchini. I just couldn't resist taking a stab at it here. But yes, it is bad. It is bad, bad, bad. So forgive me for that. So anyway, the operator says, "Not the Charles Ponzi the police are looking for." "The same," replied Ponzi proudly. "But don't you breathe a word of it to a soul." The operator swore by all he held sacred. And then Ponzi talked. And we'll find out what Charles Ponzi said after the break. Hey everybody, we're back. Thank you for taking a moment to support the brands who support Kinda Murdery. I'd like to mention briefly, as I often do, and as you know, that I have cerebral palsy, and I would like for Kinda Murdery and our community to be not only a forum, but a support network for people with disabilities, physical or otherwise, and really for anyone whose life story is one that maybe people are not that aware of and needs to be shared. I mean, everyone's story needs to be shared, but I think that there are stories and realities among us that we often don't consider, and I hope that our show can be a chance for some people who are living in those realities to be heard. So if you'd like to connect with me and share your story, either so I can share it with everyone on the show, or if you would just like to share and have what you share be kept private, we can do that instead. But please don't hesitate to reach out to me. kindamurdery@gmail.com or @kindamurdery on all social media. Also, please do remember, in fact, program it into your phone, there is a new free 3-digit number, 988, that you can call to be connected immediately with someone who cares and receive counseling for substance use, mental health issues, or suicidal thoughts. That's 988. If you are in acute crisis, please do not hesitate to call that number. And please never, ever forget that the world is a far better place with you in it. And if you are not in acute crisis, but you feel the need to share your burdens, or you just like to make a connection, you just like someone to be there for your story, then please do reach out to me. Again, that's kindamurdery@gmail.com or @kindamurdery on all social media. I would love to hear from you. But I'm not the resource if your challenges are immediate. In that case, call 988. Speak to a caring professional. But I'm absolutely here for you if your troubles are less acute and you just need a shoulder. All right, thank you for giving me the time to talk about that. By the way, I wanted to remind everybody, I have those kick-ass, full-color, vinyl Kinda Murdery stickers that I would love to send to you, and all you have to do is send me your mailing address. Again, kindamurdery@gmail.com or @kindamurdery on all social media. Sarah is the brave woman whose story I shared on Thursday's episode. Sarah, it was great to hear from you again, and yes, I've got those stickers for you, but you've got to send me your address. And finally, please do leave reviews. It doesn't just make me feel good, it also helps the pod become more visible, and even more importantly, when you leave reviews and tell people how you feel about the show, it helps to build our community. And I'm so proud of the way in which this community, the Kinda Murdery community, is becoming a place where people feel safe and comfortable to share when they're troubled and to receive support, not just from me, but from all of us. So yes, please do leave reviews. It helps in so many ways. And with that, it's time to get back to American Grifter, Run, Chucky, Run, Charles Ponzi on the lam. Kinda Murdery resumes now. Listen, Ponzi said softly, looking around to make sure they were not overheard. If I tell you something very secret, will you promise to keep your mouth shut? The operator nodded. Ponzi bent still closer. Do you know who I am? He asked. The operator smiled. Andrea Luciana, the waiter, he said. Not at all. I am Charles Ponzi, the financial wizard. The operator started. A gleam of admiration came into his eyes. Not the Charles Ponzi the police are looking for. The same, replied Ponzi proudly. But don't you breathe a word of it to a soul. The operator swore by all he held sacred. And then Ponzi talked. Police Commissioner Edward U. Curtis of Boston knew what he was doing in assigning Police Inspector John F. Mitchell to the State Attorney General's office when the worldwide hunt for Ponzi started. Mitchell had a reputation for always getting his man. It was Mitchell who uncovered the famous automobile ring which encircled New England. It was Mitchell who brought to successful unraveling several Boston blackmailing plots. When Ponzi refused to return to Massachusetts and serve his sentence, Inspector Mitchell set the wheels of justice in motion. It was all done very quietly. Too much publicity would have defeated his purpose. Ponzi had boasted he would never come back to Massachusetts to serve his time. Mitchell intended to see that Ponzi did. The police officer was an experienced manhunter. He had run down and captured his quarry too often to be dismayed at Ponzi's disappearance. So Inspector Mitchell proceeded in a leisurely fashion. In a conference with Attorney General Jay Benton and District Attorney Thomas C. O'Brien, he suggested that wanted circulars be sent out to police departments throughout the world. The officer took his time. He intended to be thorough. It was decided that Europe in particular should be heavily circularized because of the belief that Ponzi had gone to one of the many countries there. For the first time since Ponzi's disappearance, the toils of the law were slowly but surely closing in on the wizard. All unknowingly, Ponzi had made another serious mistake. He had forgotten the fact that back in 1908 he had grown a mustache. But for that, he might have bluffed his way to freedom. Mitchell spent a lot of time and put in a great deal of thought on that police circular. Several conferences were held on the best way to circularize Ponzi. Boston knew him as a clean-shaven chap, but Inspector Mitchell recalled that back in 1908 when he was arrested in Montreal for check forgery and mugged for the Rogues Gallery, he'd worn a mustache. A mustache is a common disguise, and Inspector Mitchell acted upon the theory that Ponzi had forgotten all about this episode back in 1908. After much deliberation, it was decided that the best and surest way to get Ponzi was to send out his description with the Montreal Rogues Gallery picture. However, unwilling to take chances, another circular with a picture showing Ponzi smooth-shaven was sent along with it. The circulars went out. Inspector Mitchell settled back to await developments. One of the circulars, scattered to the four corners of the world, found its way eventually into the city room of a Texas newspaper office. Yet Ponzi's luck still held. Nothing happened at Galveston to arouse his suspicions. The police knew nothing of that, he was certain. After a brief touch at Houston, only one more port of call remained before the prow of the Italian ship would at last be turned towards Italy and certain freedom. Ponzi grew a trifle careless. He made still another mistake. He let drop the fact that he understood English, and the captain, who happened to overhear the remark, subconsciously made a mental note of it. It might be useful to have an interpreter on board in case of trouble with customs. Not that he expected any trouble, but it was just as well to be prepared. Day by day, as the chances of arrest grew less and less, Ponzi's egotism grew more and more pronounced. To him, his freedom was sure. Those American police are fools, Ponzi repeated time after time to the wireless operator, now his confidant. I have nothing to fear now. Absolutely nothing. And the operator agreed with him wholeheartedly. He was proud of his compatriot, and even more vain that Ponzi had taken him into his confidence. He read the police messages, which he still occasionally intercepted with much zest and amusement, as he realized that he, and he alone, was aware of the identity and whereabouts of the man who had aroused police all over the world. If only the operator had some confidant to whom he could have boasted a trifle about his knowledge, then his contentment would have been complete. It was not often that a wireless operator was the bosom friend of a man as famous as Charles Ponzi. But of course he would remain silent. Hadn't he given his word? The ship put into Houston, where it was scheduled to remain only a few hours. The wireless operator planned to do a little shopping on shore. Ponzi met him just as he left his stateroom. "Remember," he said in a low voice, "not a word." "Of course not," the operator replied, a little hurt at this implied lack of confidence. "Haven't I promised?" And with that, Ponzi had to be content. He walked over to the gangplank and watched the operator out of sight. Then he turned away with a sigh. He would have liked to have gone ashore with him, but that was too much risk with freedom so near. Although he felt there was little chance of discovery from the police, they were just too stupid. Still, it was just as well not to take chances. He reluctantly left the deck and went below. The operator drew a deep sigh of relief as his feet touched the solid ground and he heard the din of traffic a few blocks distant. It was good to be on land again, even if it was in a strange city where he knew no one. Then happened one of those unexplainable things that readers of fiction will call far-fetched, and yet they occur frequently in real life. As the operator turned the corner, he bumped into an old acquaintance from Boston, John Smith, a former customs officer from that city. The wireless operator was overjoyed at the meeting. He learned that Smith was now a resident of Houston and was a ship chandler. His tongue continued to wag. He felt extremely friendly to this one man whom he knew in this city. Without thinking, in a burst of confidence, he confided the secret he had promised never to reveal. Charles Ponzi was on his ship, disguised as a waiter. Smith was apparently unimpressed. He dismissed the subject without comment and turned to other topics. But Smith did some quick thinking as he carried on a light conversation with the unsuspecting operator. He knew Charles Ponzi was wanted by the police. He knew also there was little chance of extradition once Ponzi got to Italy. "Can't you meet me tonight for supper and a show?" Smith asked finally. The operator's face clouded with disappointment. He was very sorry, but it would be impossible. The ship was sailing just as soon as they took their cargo on board, a matter of only an hour or two. Smith's eyelids barely flickered at this intelligence. Another time, perhaps. Smith was no longer interested in the operator. He had learned what he wanted, and there was little time in which to act. He glanced at his watch, pleading a previous engagement. The two men chatted a few seconds longer and then parted. Smith waited until the Italian was out of sight. Then he hurried to the sheriff's office. "Charles Ponzi is on board an Italian ship in the harbor," he said as he burst into the sheriff's office. "Is that so?" said the sheriff. "And who is Charles Ponzi?" Smith explained as best he could, but the sheriff took little interest and refused to take any action. He was sure it was a case of mistaken identity. He doubted his authority to board a foreign vessel. "I don't reckon there's anything we can do, Smith," he said at last. "We'd best keep out of it. Let Massachusetts get her own criminals. We have enough right here to keep us busy." Undismayed, Smith took his leave and started for the newspaper office. Time was growing short. At the Houston Press, he met city editor Webb C. Arts, and in Arts found an interested listener. He told him the entire story. "Sure, I know about Ponzi," said Arts, fumbling among some papers on his littered desk. "Here's the police circular that the Attorney General's office sent me some time ago." "Ponzi's on that boat," Smith said earnestly. "I'm certain of that." "If he is, we're going to nab him," promised Arts. "Foreign ship or no foreign ship, we should worry about that. If it really is Ponzi, it's a whale of a story and one that every newspaper from coast to coast will play in the banner heads. And you say the boat is only here for a short time? Well, let's go." Smith and Arts returned to the sheriff's office. The sheriff was still there. This time Arts did the talking. He was terse and to the point. He used very few words, and those few he did use were eloquent. The sheriff listened as Arts supplemented Smith's information and threatened immediate action if help was not forthcoming. "Well," said the sheriff as Arts finished and stood waiting, watch in hand, "I ain't got no time to go out on any such wild goose chases, but I'll let you have my deputy sheriff. Lacey," he called. "Arts thinks there's a crook on board that foreign ship at the docks. Run down there with him, will you, and see what you can find out." "Whatever's done has got to be done in a hurry," warned Smith. "Come on, Lacey," cried Arts. "Moments count." The door closed behind the two. More difficulties presented themselves. The streets were crowded. Traffic was heavy in the vicinity of the docks. The car stalled. A truck broke down ahead, halting the stream of slowly moving machines. Then, a clear stretch of space. It looked as though they were going to make it. The speedometer rose to 35 miles, 45, and crept to 50. Traffic snarled up again. The car shot through for the only open lane. A shrill whistle rang out above the din of traffic. A police officer springing from somewhere blocked the passage with uplifted hand. "Damn!" growled Arts as the screeching brakes brought the car to a sudden halt. A deep-throated boat whistle sounded from the docks, still some distance ahead. "Tell that fool to get out of the way," Arts demanded. "That may be the boat." But the police officer had already recognized them and stood aside. The automobile started again with the exhaust wide open, gathered speed quickly, and rushed on. A few moments later, the car drew up beside the wharf where the Sickfoss Non-Vobis had docked a few hours before. Her berth was empty. The ship had sailed. "Damn!" said Arts again to no one in particular. "Now what?" asked Deputy Lacey a few moments later as Arts bustled around questioning some of the stevedores and longshoremen. "The boat's been gone some time. There was less cargo to take than they thought. That was probably the boat we heard while we were tied up in traffic. Anyway, she's gone." "Perhaps it was a wild goose chase after all," suggested Lacey. "We might as well just go back." "We'll go back," agreed Arts. "There's nothing further can be done here, but I'm going to follow that boat. I've found that she makes one more stop at New Orleans." Back at the sheriff's office an hour or so afterwards, they discovered the sheriff slightly discomfited, holding a telegram just received from the Attorney General's office in response to a request for Ponzi's description. "That may have been Ponzi at that," admitted the sheriff ruefully. "It sounds like him." "Of course it was Ponzi," snapped Arts. "And furthermore, I'm going to follow that ship by land to New Orleans if it breaks me. I'm not going to let a good story like this slip through my fingers. I want you to let Lacey go with me." But the sheriff hesitated. It entailed the expenditure of considerable money with a possibility of failure. Arts, surmising what was passing in the sheriff's mind, offered to finance the trip out of his own pocket. The offer was accepted. Arts and Lacey arrived in New Orleans considerably ahead of the steamer. At the customs house, they disclosed their identity and voiced their suspicions. A plan was discussed to get the suspected Italian waiter on shore. The boat came into port and was boarded in the usual manner by customs officials. Learning that Andrea Luciano was the only man, according to the captain, who spoke English, the customs official in charge ordered a man ashore to the custom house with the papers. Andrea was given the mission. Meanwhile, 2 Texans were pacing the dock impatiently. Would the subterfuge work? Would Ponzi leave the ship under any circumstances? Now that Art and Lacey had gone this far, they were determined to see it through. Just as the two were getting anxious, Lacey touched Arts on the arm. "There's somebody coming off the ship now," he said. "Is that our man?" The two approached the rough-looking foreigner who had reached the dock and had started toward town with some official-appearing documents under his arm. "What's the name of that ship?" Arts asked, pointing to the sic vos non vobis. The man stared at him stupidly and shrugged his shoulders. "Mio non capace," he said, and began to move on. Arts had already recognized him by the mustache and held him by the arm. "Come on," he said harshly. "How do you get that way? You can't fool us with that line." "Yes, cut it out," ordered Lacey, drawing closer. "You know who you are. You're Charles Ponzi." Ponzi started imperceptibly as the officer pulled the wanted circular from his pocket. "It's him, all right," said Arts. "Mio Andrea Luciana," protested Ponzi. "Mio non capisce English." "Oh, shut up," said Lacey. By the way, side note, Zevin here. I know that my fake Italian accent and fake Italian is just awful. Forgive me. "Oh, shut up," said Lacey, now sure of his ground. "We've got you good. It was too bad you pulled that job in Montreal back in 1908 and then let them mug you with a mustache. It's a dead giveaway." Ponzi remained silent. "Come on now," threatened Lacey, showing his badge. "Come clean. Either you'll come across or we'll let you stay in a town that hates your kind and eats them alive. What do you say to that?" Ponzi finally got into a taxicab and they were driven to a hotel where they talked the situation over. Lacey admitted that he had no authority to take him back to Texas, but told Ponzi that Italians were rather unwelcome in New Orleans, owing to some trouble that had been had in the Italian quarter. "All in all, Ponzi," concluded Lacey, "you stand a much better chance under Ma Ferguson than you do here." They argued a bit more, and at the end of several hours, Ponzi decided to go back to Texas with them. As soon as they returned to Houston, the sheriff of Harris County put in a long-distance telephone call to Boston Police Headquarters asking if Inspector Mitchell wanted Ponzi. Mitchell wired to hold him, and later sent another wire giving classifications and measurements. Word was sent back to Boston that Ponzi was under lock and key. Ponzi had been captured at last, but he was still 2,000 miles away from Massachusetts, a state to which he had boasted he would never return. The telephone rang sharply in Inspector Mitchell's office in the State House on Beacon Hill, Boston, as he sat patiently waiting for a reply to his 4 telegrams asking where Charles Ponzi had been confined. The telephone rang again and again. Mitchell leaned over his desk and lifted the receiver from its hook. "Hello," he said. It was the State House operator who answered. "Will you pay for a toll call from Texas?" Mitchell replied that he would. There was a low hum on the line as he waited for the connection to be made, broken by a series of clicks as operators over the 2,000-mile circuit kept the line open. Then a receiver clicked. "Hello," a voice said. "Is this Inspector Mitchell?" "It is," replied Mitchell. "This is Charles Ponzi," the voice continued. "Will you let me come back to Massachusetts in the custody of the sheriff here?" Mitchell paused before answering. He saw Ponzi was up to his old tricks. He was positive that just as soon as he got outside the state of Texas, it would be, "Goodbye, Ponzi." "Hello," said Ponzi. "Are you still there? Will you let me do it?" "Nothing doing, Charlie," Mitchell told him. "You've pulled your last stunt with us." "Is that so?" said Ponzi. "Well then," he taunted, "you'll have to come down and get me. I won't come back. I'll fight first." "All right, Charlie," said Mitchell good-naturedly. "We'll fight." The inspector hung up. Hostilities between Charles Ponzi and Inspector Mitchell had been renewed. Ponzi put up a stiff fight to remain in Texas. The entire state seemed to have fallen under his hypnotic influence, and it was his boast that he would never go back to Massachusetts as long as Governor Ma Ferguson was in power. But the Massachusetts authorities persisted. As Ponzi felt the long arm of the Attorney General's office reaching out for him, he dispatched telegram after telegram to Governor Alvin T. Fuller of Massachusetts asking for clemency. This proved unavailing, and he appealed to his native country, asking Mussolini to intercede. Inspector Mitchell was not finding the job quite as easy as he had anticipated. It looked for a while as though Ponzi would make good his boast. The Boston police departments were thwarted at every twist and turn. They were asked to defend a case whose merits had already been decided by a Massachusetts court. At the first hearing held on July 10, 1926, much to the surprise of Assistant Attorney General A.R. Shrigley of Massachusetts, the proceedings took on the color of a court trial. Action was postponed until after the Democratic election later in July. It was alleged that this was done to save the Italian vote. From then, until Ponzi lost his last appeal in January 1927, his attorneys did all in their power to prevent his extradition to Massachusetts. But Ponzi lost, and Inspector Mitchell arrived in Houston to take the former financial wizard back to Boston. He had arrived not an instant too soon. Ponzi was still planning to defeat the forces of law and order. The jail was under construction, and there was Ponzi, with 26 other prisoners confined in a single cell. Mitchell happened in unobserved. The prisoners were gathered in a group talking in low tones. "All right, Charlie," said Mitchell. "We're all set to go. Get your stuff ready." But Ponzi played for time. "Let's wait over several days," he hedged, "and go back by boat." "Nothing doing," replied Mitchell. "We're going out on the 11:30. It was already after 11 o'clock. "I'm not going back with you," said Ponzi, still stalling for time. "If you try to take me back to Massachusetts, I'll kill myself. I shall never go back to Boston alive." "All right, Charlie," returned Mitchell, not at all disturbed by the threat. "You can suit yourself. It's nothing to me. My papers state I'm here for the body of one Charles Ponzi, dead or alive. I'm going to take you back to Boston. If you want to bump yourself off, well, that's your business." Ponzi looked thoughtful. "Only don't forget, Charlie. If you do that, you'll go back in a box in the baggage car while I ride in the Pullman eating 3 square meals a day and knowing exactly where you'll stay put, without watching." Ponzi, with less than half an hour before train time, had other objections, which Mitchell overrode in a more or less peremptory fashion. Fearful that writs might be served, the police officer took him to the railroad station at the same time secretly holding a fast automobile in readiness, filled with gasoline and oil, in which he planned to kidnap Ponzi should it be impossible to leave the city by train. But the financial wizard had played his last card. However, Ponzi remained defiant, even when a gun and some 100 cartridges were found concealed in the lining of his traveling bag, where they had remained hidden since 1920. Later, he confessed that a jail delivery had been planned for that very night, in which the prisoners counted on overpowering the attendants when they answered a sick call from the cell. Once the door was open, the rest of the getaway would have been easy, but Mitchell's sudden arrival had prevented the plan from being carried out. They went back to Boston by train, locked in a compartment where they remained until they reached St. Louis. Here they rode about town in a taxi until train time, and then were locked into a compartment of another train, in which they stayed until the train passed over the New York-Massachusetts boundary line. But Ponzi had admitted his defeat long before that. He turned to Inspector Mitchell just after they'd left Texas behind. "You've beaten me, Inspector," he said simply. "I told you I would," replied Mitchell without rancor. "I told you so the day you telephoned me in Boston. You insulted the United States, you insulted the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and you got just what any man gets who starts out to beat the law. It can't be done because there's no such thing as a perfect crime." Charles Ponzi, juggler of other people's millions, was now safely behind the stone walls at the state's prison at Charlestown, Massachusetts. The manicured fingers through which passed the life savings of many were now occupied sewing on buttons in the knitting room at the prison factory. But although the steel gates of the prison would swing open for him once again at the conclusion of his sentence, he would not walk forth a free man. The doors of America had been forever shut to Ponzi, who had no respect for the laws of the United States and defied the authorities of Massachusetts. He had sacrificed his rights to citizenship and would be deported. Charles Ponzi would be released just 7 years later in 1934, and he would live for another 15 years after his release, until he finally died, a broken man, in a charity hospital in Rio de Janeiro in 1949. You'll forgive me if I don't shed a tear for Charles Ponzi, an American grifter who swindled so many on his way to a tragic end. You've just heard Run, Chucky, Run, Charles Ponzi on the Lam. I'll see you back here on Thursday, October 6th, for the next installment of Kinda Murdery's American Grifter. I'm Zevon Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery. If you've enjoyed today's Kinda Murdery, please tell your friends and family. Tell strangers. Leave a review. It's the best way to ensure that I can keep telling that special brand of bizarre and terrible tales that you'll only find here on Kinda Murdery.